Oh, okay.
How intuitive.
So back in 2011, we have a two-part presentation. So I'm going to do the first part, and then John's going to come up and do the second part. Back in 2011, I presented to you on the National Collection's Lafayette Escadrille Insignia. And for those of you who weren't here, that insignia involves 6 pieces of Lafayette Escadrille panels from original aircraft. You can see that all of these panels are very similar. If you recall, back in 2011 when we met and talked about this, these insignia actually came, we think, from a stencil. And that's why they're so uniform. And actually that was Carl Bobrough's deduction. And of course the wonderful thing about a stencil is that once it's cut out, you can flip it over and do the reverse side of the aircraft. So what they would do with the stencil is they would lay it out and we think pencil in the outline. And then they would come up with their colors and paint the insignia. So they weren't using the stencil to actually, spray on the insignia. It was 1917, but they were doing it to outline the pencil marks. And when you look at detail under the museum's insignia, you see the pencil marks in many cases. But the great deduction here, we know about the Hinkle and Willis sort of controversy. They supposedly both of them found introduced the insignia, and after Willis died in 1963, after the big Paul Garber exhibit of Lafayette Escadrille and other material, Hinkle then claimed to have been really the originator of the insignia. Of course, Willis couldn't argue with him. But there was that kind of rivalry between the two. This particular piece of the 6, and I'll point out one thing. It didn't work very well, but the whole concept behind the insignia was that from a distance it would look like blue, white, red, like the French flag. I'm jumping ahead of myself. This one piece here of the 6, this one example from a SPAD 7 does not have a provenance. And in the world of museums and collectors, provenance is everything. You have an object, but where did it actually come from? Where's the chain of custody? Is it really from an aircraft and so forth? We know that it's authentic because we can see the fabric stitching and everything lines up with the longerons on the SPAD 7 and so forth. So we're not concerned with the authenticity of the piece. We know it is what it is. But where it comes from is really the fascinating part. And we know through a lot of research, some of it passed down from Paul Garber and others, some we've done ourselves, that various pieces have certain story. They came from certain aircraft. Sometimes the pieces became so obscure that we actually had to go and research them through phone books to see who the donor was and if they were related to a certain pilot. So there's a history behind these pieces which is really fascinating. And this piece that you see here, it turns out, which had no provenance, appeared in March 1918 on the cover of Flying Magazine, an American publication. So in 1955, which is the actual accession number in the museum, begins with the year that it was supposedly donated, 1955. What happened between 1918 and 1955? Here it is on the cover of an American flying magazine. In March, you can see the date, March 1918, and how it could get onto the cover of a magazine when it is just before that, flying in France. The inscription with this fabric states that it's an emblem from one of the aircraft flown by Royal Lufbery, in which he shot down 5 Germans. And it's signed by Thaw. And this inscription here on the lower right is also on the photo on the cover of the magazine, except the inscription, you can see here on the magazine, it's right below the ribbon and the chin in the insignia, whereas over here it's in front of the chin. And what we think, all of these various elements of this insignia line up exactly. So we're very confident that the photo on the cover of Flying Magazine in March of 1918 is the fabric that's donated to the museum. And so that begins to give us a provenance. We know in March of 1918 it's on the cover of this magazine. The people laying out the magazine apparently had to deal with the fact that they were trying to make it as large as possible, but the inscription is kind of making that difficult, so they appear to crop it and move it down here. And, well, we'll get to this in a little bit, this little stamp here. I don't want to blow the surprise behind that. But the fascinating thing is it's on the cover of this magazine. And on the cover, in the caption on the cover of this magazine, explains that it was from Lufberry's aircraft. And it turns out that in March of 1918, there was a very major exhibit in New York City at the Anderson Gallery of works of art by the famous French aviator, artist, painter, Henry Barrett. It was actually called Skyfighters of France. Later, Barrett would publish a book, Skyfighters of France, with his paintings in it and stories of aviators. But before he published his book, the exhibit in New York was actually named Skyfighters of France. It's at the Anderson Gallery. It's full of paintings by Barrett. It also has, remember, March of 1918, the war is still going on. Barrett's wonderful oil paintings of combat in the air, but also this exhibit in New York has Georges Guynemer's Spad is actually shipped over and is part of the exhibit. And apparently also this piece of fabric. So that's a program for the exhibit in New York. Turned out this exhibit not only was in New York, but it traveled around the country to all sorts of cities. And although so much of the time we concentrate on what's happening at the front and the actual squadrons and the aircraft, back home in the United States there was a tremendous effort in many different ways to support the war through donating money and other things to support the effort. This exhibit was meant to raise funds, and so people would pay 25 cents, 50 cents to attend the exhibit as it went around the country. And the people behind the exhibits, this big national tour, were the wife of the President of the United States and the sort of top members of the society. They had to find a way to be involved in the war, and therefore they got behind efforts like this. And including, it turns out through a lot of research, that Bill Thaw's mother was one of the major people behind the exhibit and tour. And she was part of the Thaw family from Pittsburgh, which, if you don't know, was extremely wealthy family.
They were extreme Francophiles, too.
Yes.
Remember at that time,
absolutely.
Benjamin Jr. was secretary to the American Embassy in France, and his, let's see, trying to remember back from my Blair Thaw research, his sister Henrietta was married to a Lawrence Slade, who was a banker who was actively involved in the Paris office of his bank. His cousin Catherine was a volunteer nurse over in France. In fact, Mrs. Thaw Sr. maintained an apartment in Paris. So there was quite a deal, there was quite a bit of Francophile involvement in the Thaw family, even before, going back to before the war.
So, how it actually got, this piece of fabric got into this exhibit, we don't have a smoking gun in terms of, you know, a letter from Bill Thaw's mother to Bill saying, give us a donation. But at some point, we know that this piece of fabric was put into the exhibit. And Barrett, it's actually, we found a manifest of the SS La Touraine that left Bordeaux on January 19th of 1918. And on board, when you look at the manifest, on board is Henry Faré and this whole cadre of French diplomats and a number of aviators and Faré, and on that ship, and presumably, of course, all of his artwork that was coming over for the exhibit, but presumably also Gunemer's Spad and the piece of fabric. So somehow at Bordeaux, by January 19th, they're loading onto this ship all this material for the exhibit in New York in March. So if you backtrack from January 19th, you know that the fabric is not from any of the 103rd's spads. Of course, we can tell from the way it's laid out and painted, it's not from any of those spads, because by the time the 103rd has adopted the insignia of the Lafayette Escadrille, the design starts to change. And so we already know that it's really not one of theirs. But to actually prove that, which is a whole other matter, we can tell that that piece of fabric very likely would have had to have been on the ship, the La Touraine, in January 19th, because all of the people who came for the exhibit were there. And we think Gunemer's Spad was there as well, in the hold of the ship. So if you take January 19th, 1918, as the loadout of the exhibit in Bordeaux to come to New York, then you can figure, well, which Spad was it? The last time Lufberry is flying is December. December of 1917, where basically the Lafayette Escadrille pilots, for the most part, except for one or two flights in January, right, John?
James Norman Hall scored their last victory on New Year's Day.
Yeah.
And December 2nd and 4th, I think, Lufberry got his last few, and two of them were scored in S-1777, which was also flown by Henry Sweet Jones, and which had the swastika on the side. And it occurs to me, that's a well-photographed plane.
Yeah.
If you can get a close-up of the Sioux head on that plane, check to see if the swastika on the medallion is elongated like the one in your specimen, and that could settle the matter.
Well, unfortunately, the problem with that plane is the only good...
Because that has a unique... the way they did the swastika is a bit elongated. That could be a hell of a clue.
The other thing we try to use are these ribbons, because, believe it or not...
They were never quite the same.
They were never quite the same. And actually, Alan Tully, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, Alan Tully, who is as interested in this stuff as I am, or in John, and more so, has done some fascinating work on Lafayette Escadrille Insignia, and we go back and forth about the ribbons, because it seems that the ribbons go from... Now, one thing I should say as a sidebar to this, you know from Insignia on aircraft that there's a concept in the people who are designing it at the squadron level, whether it's an American flag or an Indian head or whatever it is, that icon is always applied, or almost always applied, not always, but almost always applied, such that the icon is looking towards the front of the aircraft, which makes sense, right? So it flips when you go from the left to the right. And the propeller is metaphorically pushing against the object. So these ribbons flutter. So when you see an American flag on the side of an aircraft, that flag is fluttering as if the propeller is blowing. It gets a little difficult with the flag because you don't want to reverse the flag and fly it like that. But so in this case, we see the ribbon flutter. But when you look at the few dozen examples that we can find of various insignia painted on Lafayette Escadrille aircraft, and a few early ones on the 103rd, you can see that these ribbons sometimes are fluttering very actively and sometimes are not. And it's very interesting to try to take the photographs, the serial numbers, and I would never have actually thought myself of doing this, but Alan Tully, absolutely brilliant man, what has gone through the exercise of figuring out if you can correlate the excitement of these fluttering ribbons to the period of the aircraft when they were built and made. And there's actually a really fascinating correlation. So that being said, we know it's supposedly from one of Lafayett's aircraft. On the inscription, which actually over time, when you compare it to the inscription on the magazine, it's exactly the same, except this edge gets, it's been handled a lot, so this edge is not very clear. And it kind of boggled us for a while what Thaw is talking about. But once we realized what this exhibit was doing, going around the country raising money, what was it specifically raising money for? Again and again and again, newspaper writers in the United States who are writing about these exhibits, this touring around the country, talk about how French aviators and soldiers do not have life insurance, believe it or not. Whereas in the United States, there's a system of life insurance for combatants, and for including aviators. And the idea is that there are all these orphans of soldiers and aviators who are left destitute. And the purpose of this exhibit is to raise funds for these orphans. So when Thaw writes, it's an emblem given to the members of the orphans of his French, as a little garbled. We've had various French speakers try to disassemble it. But he's writing about this actual organization, which is started in France, beginning of the war. It's for orphans of combatants, orphans, in this case, of aviators. And it's taken up in New York by all of these society matrons into an actual full-fledged organization to raise money for the French orphans of combatants. And it's actually very sophisticated. It goes from being a certain name that's given out to the newspaper writers to a more formal name, to an address in New York City on Fifth Avenue where they have headquarters, and they're raising money for these orphans who have no sort of insurance to help them after their fathers have died. So that's what he's writing about. He's saying this is donated by the members of the Lafayette Escadrille to this organization that's trying to raise money for the orphans of aviators. Turns out, frankly, when you look at all the research, it's really about orphans of combatants, not about orphans of aviators. And you can hardly find any reference in French journals to orphans of aviators, just orphans of combatants. So somehow in the translation from the organization in New York, and Mrs. Thaw, if she really wasn't directly involved with her son Bill in getting this donation, it's gone from being an effort for the orphans of combatants to orphans of aviators. Probably a little bit more detail than you want, but it's kind of fascinating when you burrow into this that it's getting to that kind of level. Now, I'm going to want to, this is again where it shows up on the fabric and where it shows up in the picture of the fabric, where you can see this cropped and move over. there's this seal, which is the commandant of the something escadrilles de combat, some sort of seal that's stamped on this photograph. And when we move ahead,
Those seals are stamped on lots and lots of documents, and they were often used as an official signature of the commandant of a particular unit. For example, you'll see, you go through a logbook that shows what a squadron's planes were doing. It's stamped at the end of each month with this signature, and sometimes the signature of the individual handwritten signature is written over the top of it. And so you see that all over the place in French military aviation documents.
A brevet for a French aviator is always stamped with the same stamp.
Yeah.
May say something different here, but it's the same stamp.
Well, from what I can see from this distance, you misspelled some of the words and thoughts, like
This is 2011.
O-E-U, it should be O-E-U-V-R-E, which means work.
Right. The image in the stamp, if you recall, is the Liberty. That's not the official name of it. It's given a different name, but it's the Statue of Liberty is the way we think of it. It's in the French context, it's slightly different. But that was a very familiar and First World War symbol of French stamps, government stamps with the Statue of Liberty in the middle. We'll get back to that stamp in just a minute. Now, so we know that the museum's fabric is at this exhibit in March of 1918. So when does it show up in the museum? 5 or 6 pieces we can show the donation and all that, figure that all out, but this one we can't. And for a while, no one's really worried because it's actually falsely or accidentally attributed to a donation from a gentleman named Smith. Smith has actually given us one of the other pieces, and because he has a photo attached that looks just like our piece, except for this big blue line on the side of it, turned out we had to switch them. And so we realized that we can't attach it to the Smith record. It's not from Smith. And his donation was in 1955. We do know in 1936, this object, which is an actual exact copy of the one of our object, this is painted onto a wood board by artists from, along with other insignia, from the Works Project Administration. And they did all of these reproductions of insignia. The fascinating thing about this is, when you match it up to our 6 pieces, it only exactly matches the one we're talking about because of the ribbons and everything else. So we know the museum probably had it by 1936 because someone is looking at it and making this copy of it. So somewhere between 18 and 36 we got it. I went off on a false trail a few days ago thinking, ha-ha, 1963, Paul Garber's great exhibit of the Lafayette Escadrille has this case with prints and objects related to him and objects related to Lufbery. And there is Henry Farré's oil painting of Lufbery. So if in 63 it's in this case, whoever gave the oil painting of Lufbery, which was in the Farré exhibit in 1918, probably gave us the fabric. Unfortunately, that turned out was donated in 1960. So we still haven't found who donated it. And this piece down here, one of Lufbery's instruments from the plane he crashed in, is actually donated in 1931. And the record doesn't say, oh, and by the way, there's a piece of fabric that came along with it, unfortunately. So there you have it. We're kind of at a loss to know who gave it to us, but we do know that it was made a tour of the country, and it's fairly well-known and pretty well-documented object. And we actually even bought the magazine when it was on eBay when we saw it, because it's it's really part of the history of the object. So that was fascinating. But we still come back to the issue of the stamp. And of course, you know, when you see a photograph in 1918 of the museum's piece of fabric, it's got a stamp, and our object doesn't have a stamp. You have to scratch your head and say, why is that? That's where I turn it over to John.
Okay. In fact, Charlie emailed us saying that he was looking for the stamp, and he wondered if we could actually, the Garber Photo Club, get out there and take a picture of the fabric under raking light. You know, low-angle light would help produce shadows, showing things. And let's see if I can get to, okay, we are. And so we went out, actually Carl got the email, burst out laughing, forwarded it to me. I burst out laughing because the very day before we had picked up a kit to enable us to do something called reflection transform imaging, which basically is reflective light on steroids. You can vary the position of the light striking the object. You photograph it under a number of different lights, positions of the light. You can vary where the light is coming from when somebody is viewing it. You can see the, watching down here, you can see the impact of that on the signature. And you can apply different ways of looking at it. And let's see if I can, okay, let's get the stuff more fit on here. I have to reduce it because unfortunately it's not all fitting very well on the display there.
Manually adjust the.
But we can go down here and look at the writing. And play around with the light a little bit, and you can actually see the impressions of the pen at the right light angles. But so we looked around at other places on here, and we cannot see any indication of the stamp having been pressed on it. So we think based on looking at the image on the magazine and looking at the actual fabric, that what happened was somebody decided that that stamp would make it look more authentic. That's my idea, my theory anyway. And that the stamp was put onto the cover of the magazine when the engraver made the plates.
John, switch to specular.
Oh, we are on specular. You want to normalize? This is one of the other views that you can actually notice. It really shows up the, let's go back to full. So looking at the whole image, you can actually see the black shows up, but also if we zoom in a little bit more, if we move around, you can see the rib tape show up, but you can see the black. You can also, and I'm going back to specular I think for this because that's where it does show up somewhat better. As you play around with the lighting angles, you can see the brush strokes. And you can see the thickness of the paint on there. So I think this gives us a real valuable tool in looking at fabric, for instance, for establishing information. But it's also something that
works real well on data plates.
it works real well. Yeah, it works well on objects that have been engraved, stamped, but the information is obscure. And it also shows up things that you may not, that I think it may be chemical weathering, like you see right here, this darker triangle that only shows up with lighting from this particular quadrant. You get over here, it's gone away. That lines up pretty close to the exhaust pipes on a SPAD 7 with a HISO engine. So I'm suspecting what we're seeing there is the result of the exhaust. So,
Is that carbon dating?
Well, you could do a chemical analysis wipe of that and see the content of the material.
and determine what kind of what the grade of the petrol was that they were using possibly. But we've just added a new tool to our bag of tricks for looking at the at various items in the collection. If you'll remember, what was it, a year ago, I presented about the Samson fabric that we found that had been labeled as DH4.
Right.
And one of those pieces is, we know from visual inspection, it was originally numbered aircraft 17 and had been overpainted with a 3. And as soon as when we get the chance, we'd like to rephotograph that using this technique so that we can make it more apparent to the casual observer that, yeah, there really is a 17 underneath that 3. But this was one of those cases where things just happened at the right sequence, or at the right time.
Charlie was not very happy with the end result, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. He was hoping that there would be a magic stamp underneath.
I mean, negative information is still information.
Right.
John, that stain also looks like it could be oil or fuel. It may have walked down that longeron, because that stuff travels real far on a finished piece of wood.
It may have run down the along the exhaust pipe down there too. So, but to sort of channel it there.
All right.
So there we have that.
Thank you, John. So as you can see, research is continuing. John and Charlie are deep into the fabric. When they notified the curator, Peter Jacob, about the fabric and the update information on it, he was much impressed and appreciative, because it helps define what we have in our collection and the history of that material, especially under the circumstances. We do know that at American History, they have in their collection a piece of Lafayette Escadrille fabric from Prince's SPAD. And we're trying to get them to let us to see it. They keep telling us it's in a building that has asbestos and they can't get to it, and they'll get to it. And we'll get to it next week, we'll get to it next year. So I reminded Charlie and John that they're not staff, that they're members of the public, and they can make a request as a member of the public for Smithsonian information.
One of the fabulous things, oh, I'm sorry.
We'll see if they have better.
One of the things about this fabric that's at the American History Museum that's really fascinating is that in the record, it appears alternatively to be from Norman Prince or Frederick Prince. It's donated by Frederick Prince to the museum when Garber in late 50s, early 60s is assembling all this Lafayette Escadrille material for the 1963 exhibit. And Frederick Prince, who was a member of the squadron, although according to, as Tully tells us from analyzing the squadron's combat logs, Frederick Prince never had a sortie with the squadron. It's quite surprising that he was a member of the squadron, but he actually is never recorded in the logbook as flying with them. And Alan has made a very exhaustive analysis in Excel of the two journals that show you what plane is flying when, on what date, by who. Is Lufberry flying his plane on this date or somebody else's plane? It's an amazing thing if you're interested in this, the work Alan Tully has done. So here's this piece of fabric that Frederick Prince donates to the museum. And it sort of goes back and forth. Is it Frederick Prince's or Norman Prince's? And you know, if you think about it, I won't make this too long an explanation. When you think about it, if it's Norman, in fact, even if it's Frederick's, it's got to be